What I am going to talk about today is the military budget. And to explain my title, I have for some time been frustrated because I believe we heavily overspend on the U.S. military to the detriment of our economy, and I have been frustrated by my inability to get people to understand that. The frustration grew until recently, because I think we're now getting some attention. I would hear people debate the deficit, and they would talk. Greg Mankiw, major advisor to candidate Romney, as he was to President Bush, recently wrote in the New York Times on Sunday that we have to either raise taxes or cut Social Security and Medicare. And I get frustrated that this grossly overinflated military budget is left out. I feel like the kid who said the emperor has no clothes because nobody else noticed. But it occurred to me that the problem is not that the emperor has no clothes, but that this emperor is wearing 4 sweaters, 3 suits, 6 hats, a lot of boots, and gives away clothes to everybody in the world. My purpose is to say it's the military budget, stupid, to go back to that Clinton era with the economy. My fundamental point is we'll be spending in this fiscal year more than $650 billion on the U.S. military, much more than Medicare. The military budget, if you leave out the entitlements, you talk about the discretionary budget, the Departments of Health and Human Services and Education and Transportation, Justice and State, the military budget is more than half of that total. The military is 54%, the other is 46%. The amount is just staggering. We have 2 military budgets. We have the base budget, it's called, which is about $535 billion, which is the Pentagon. And then whenever we go to war, the Pentagon, to try to keep the number looking smaller, and the presidents, they're not autonomous, come up with a separate budget for the war. The way it works, for those of you who are familiar with the legal profession, it would appear that we have the military on retainer. That is, we pay them a certain amount every year, or we pay the budget every year, but if they go to war, they bill us. So the total is $650 billion. $120 billion right now is for the war in Afghanistan. But we'll save a little bit when we pull out of Iraq. That amount far exceeds any rational assessment of our national security. The problem with the military, whenever we spend money to do something, and when there's no longer a need, we keep spending. In 1949, Harry Truman did a great thing. Western and Central Europe consisted of countries that were poor and weak, and they were threatened by a very aggressive communism and a brutal one under Stalin. Now, they were poor and weak because of World War II. Russia was also poor, but it wasn't weak because Stalin could use that enormously repressive mechanism to put whatever nickel he did have into the military. And there was this serious threat of an advancing communism. England called Truman in 1947 and said, hey, look, I've been trying to keep the communists out of Greece. I can't handle it anymore. England doesn't have the money. You better come in. That led to the establishment of NATO in 1949. That was a great thing, and here were the elements of NATO. Poor and weak Western and Central Europe, aggressive and threatening and heavily armed communism. To keep them apart, billions and billions of American military dollars and manpower. Now, 3 of those elements were there in 1949. 2 of them have disappeared. Western and Central Europe, the countries are no longer poor and weak. There is no more Stalin, there's no more communism, there's no more Soviet Union. What hasn't changed is that we are still protecting the now wealthy nations of Western Europe against a non-existent threat. There's still Russia. Russia is not comparable in its power to the Soviet Union. I am no great fan of Russia. I am still grateful that my grandparents got the hell out of there. We have NATO. NATO was 61 years ago. Very few constructs of that sort really have a life of 61 years. It's not just Western Europe. Right after World War II, we put Marines on Okinawa. They were there in part to reassure the rest of Asia that the Japanese would be not attacked again. We still have Marines on Okinawa. They have no military function. Yes, we have a problem with China. There is air and sea power. But 10,000 Marines in Okinawa have no role. We're not going to send 10,000 Marines to fight the Chinese millions. I'll tell you why they're there. This is from the New York Times about a week ago. Defense officials say it would be catastrophic, further cuts in the military. It would force troop reductions in the Pacific. Now, we have well over 100,000 people. We have the 7th Fleet. We have troops in South Korea. They argue that even a small drawdown of, say, 5,000 troops would be seen in the region as a symbolic retreat as China expands its military capabilities. We, of course, spend far more than the Chinese spend in that year. And the Chinese are about to launch their first aircraft carrier. The first Chinese aircraft carrier is a retrofitted ship that they bought from Ukraine. I'm sure that looks pretty impressive to the Vietnamese. So we have the troops in Japan. We have a nuclear arsenal. We were ready to fight a thermonuclear war against the Soviet Union. And we had the triad. The triad is 3 ways of dropping thermonuclear weapons on the Soviet Union: Strategic Air Command, nuclear submarines, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Not coincidentally, that's one for each service. The Army has the missiles, and the Navy has the submarines, and the Air Force has the airplanes. There is no more Soviet Union to fight. I have a serious suggestion. People think I'm kidding. I want to say to the Pentagon, you know those 3 ways we have to win a thermonuclear war against the Soviet Union? Pick 2. Give up 1. You pick the one. It would probably be missiles. The others have dual use. We'd save billions of dollars. The point is that there is this view that we have to be everywhere. We are overcommitted militarily. Go back to Western Europe. The average percentage of gross domestic product spent by the Europeans on the military is 1.7%. We're more than 3 times that. Why should the U.S. be spending money to keep troops in Germany when the Germans don't feel all that worried about it? Further examples, the Air Force. Strongest Air Force in the world, fortunately, is the U.S. Air Force. You know what the second strongest Air Force in the world is? It's the U.S. Navy. I don't want to tempt fate, but if the Air Force was the strongest Air Force in the world and the Navy was tied for 3rd, I would feel very secure. I don't think we have to have 1st and 2nd place all to ourselves. President Obama's national security strategy calls on U.S. forces to be able to strike virtually any target on the planet. You cannot tell me that our national security depends on it being able to shoot anybody, anywhere, anytime. When you ask the defenders of this, they go beyond national security. Here's William Crystal in his article, National Interest and Global Responsibility. Here is the explanation. At the beginning of this century, Theodore Roosevelt worried that Americans had become so isolated from the struggles of the rest of the world and so immersed in our material prosperity, think of that, we're worried about having a decent living here at home, that they were becoming effete. Roosevelt implored Americans to look beyond the immediate needs of their daily lives and embrace as a nation a higher purpose in the world. He believed the nation could only be great if it accepted its responsibilities to advance civilization and improve the world's condition. This is American exceptionalism that God created America. I didn't make this up. God created America to be the leader in the world and to be the enforcer of order in the world. Having heard that a couple of times, I decided that I am entitled to a refund on my Bible. Because I do not remember in the version of Genesis I bought that God created NATO. I mean, he created night and day and water and earth. They explicitly demean the notion that our purpose should be to improve ourselves. Here's again Mr. Crystal. American preeminence cannot be maintained from a distance by some post-Cold War version of the Nixon Doctrine where we hang back and keep our powders dry. The United States would conceive of itself as at once a European power, an Asian power, a Middle Eastern power, and of course a Western Hemisphere power. It would act as if threats to the interests of our allies are threats to us, which they are. It would act as if instability in important regions of the world, by the way, when people in this geopolitical thing start talking about important regions of the world, you will not be surprised to know that there are no unimportant regions of the world. Every region of the world is either important in itself or it's important because it is next to an important region of the world. That's why we have to hit every target everywhere. It would act as if instability in important regions of the world and the flouting of civilized rules of conduct in those regions are threats that affect us with almost the same immediacy as if they were occurring on our doorstep. Otherwise, we would be an unreliable partner in world affairs, which would erode American preeminence and the international order. It is this notion, again, that we need to take it on ourselves to do all these things. And the last one from Jeff Jacoby, who's the leading conservative writer of the Boston Globe, quoting John Adams, who didn't understand that we had to run the world. In Adams' day, America was not the mightiest, wealthiest, and most influential nation on the face of the earth. Today it is. The United States is the world's only superpower, and if we shirk the role of global policeman, no one else will fill it. Right, because they're too smart to try to be the global superpower. With great power comes great responsibilities. One of these is destroy monsters, take down tyrants, and flout the rules of civilization. If neighborhoods and cities need policing, it stands to reason the world does too. Totally false analogy. A neighborhood or a city, they vote for the police, they pay for that police. I would be morally conflicted if I thought we could do it. But in fact, the notion that heavily armed, very brave young Americans can put down instability, can bring civility to foreign cultures. I've just had this argument with some of the administration who want us to stay in Iraq. Why? Because the Kurds don't get along with the Arabs and the Shia don't get along with the Sunni. And that is obviously true, and I regret that. But I don't think sending the American military is going to stop that. The American military is a superb force, and they can stop bad things from happening. The problem is these people think you can use the military to make good things happen. And you can't, and it does more harm than good. I have been arguing that. That gets greater force today because if we do not reduce the military, we're going to cut entitlements, i.e. Social Security and Medicare. Or we're going to raise taxes. I just quoted Mr. Mankiw, who says choice is raising taxes and cutting the entitlements. There's a great quote from Buck McKeon, who is the Republican chair of the Committee on Armed Services in the House. And he said that coming after the Pentagon because they want to protect the sacred cows of entitlement spending. I will tell you that I think that the enactment in the United States in the 20th century of Social Security and Medicare were two great social accomplishments. Prior to that, the notion of a middle-class existence when you got old was a rarity. If you weren't rich and you lived long enough, you got poor. And with the combination of those two, we created the norm of a middle-class existence, not a luxurious one. I don't understand why I would apologize for that. By the way, in Italy, they're now talking about changing the retirement age to bring it up to 60. It is, of course, in America, 65. Why have they been able to afford that retirement age? Because they don't have to have any military budget. We have subsidized this. It is now either or. It's a zero-sum game. I don't want to make cuts immediately, and I think we should be putting some money into the economy. But yes, we do have to adopt a long-range deficit reduction plan. If you do not cut the military substantially, I'm talking about ending the war in Afghanistan and cutting another 100. It would leave us at $450 billion, still more than the next 5 nations in the world put together. And, of course, about 3 of those 5 nations are our allies. Our margin of superiority at $450 billion would still be enormous. It would bring us back more to where we were under the Clinton administration. We face a choice. If we exempt the military from budget cutting, then Social Security and Medicare get hit very badly. So what are the arguments against reducing the military? One, of course, is this argument that we have to fulfill the great purpose. They do make an effort to say, if you reduce the military, we will be weak. That's based on cultural lag. Before 1940, America didn't have much of a military because we didn't need one. The only people who Americans shot in any great number after the Revolution, sadly, were each other in the Civil War. We had big oceans and there was no way to get at us. Then came the Nazis, and for 50 years, first under Hitler and then under the communists, it is true, there were evil forces in the world that threatened our existence as a free nation and had the capacity to damage us. I think it was overstated towards the end of the Cold War, but that collapsed in 1990. Since 1991, there has been no existential threat to America's existence, and we have built up a sufficient military capacity that it's hard to envision one. Given that, President Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton began to bring down the military. One reason that Bill Clinton was able to balance the budget in 2000 is that he brought down military spending. He also raised taxes on the rich and did put some limits on domestic spending, but a reduction in military spending was an important part of that. What we hear from the defenders of the unlimited Pentagon spending is that this is a bad idea, and in fact, they say, if we do this, we're going to hollow out the military. And Leon Panetta, the man who's identified as Leon Panetta, having known Panetta when he was in the House, I suspect that something happened in the CIA, and I haven't seen the DNA, but the person known as Leon Panetta says we must not make any further cuts in the military. Remember, 5,000 less troops out of 100,000 in Asia. It would sink morale. We got hit every corner of the globe. He said we must not again make the mistake that we made of hollowing out the military. And he said we made that mistake after World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the Cold War. This is Leon Panetta in October. We cannot afford to repeat the mistakes of past reductions in force that followed World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the fall of the Iron Curtain, which to varying degrees, as a result of across-the-board cuts, weakened our military. We must avoid a hollow military. Note that Mr. Panetta says that we hollowed out the military after the Cold War. A little history quiz. Who was the President of the United States after the Cold War? It was Bill Clinton. Who was Bill Clinton's budget director? Leon Panetta. Leon Panetta, and then he went on to be the chief of staff. It is extraordinary, the mind games that are going on here. He has now announced, and by the way, when he was budget director and chief of staff, he boasted that they were able to, correctly, that they were able to balance the budget. He's now retroactively telling us that he balanced the budget by hollowing out the military. By the way, the argument that he hollowed out the military is nonsense. I was talking to Gordon Adams, who was his deputy at the OMB for Defense, and I've asked them this question, you've hollowed out the military. Can anybody think of any instance in the last 30 years, I certainly cannot, nobody I know can point to one, where America had an objective it wanted to accomplish with military force and we were too weak to do it? I can think of no case where we did not have the military force to do it. By the way, this hollowed out military was very successful in bombing Milosevic into submission, so we got some good results in Croatia. And then this hollowed out military, after all, George Bush becomes president, he didn't have that much time to, I don't know how you unhollow something, stuff it again. He went into 2 wars. I mean, this notion that the military was hollowed out is nonsense. One of the leading Republicans, we had an angry debate, and he said, no, there you go again, you're trying to cut the military. And I remember in the 90s when we had hangar queens. What were hangar queens? Well, they were these expensive airplanes that stayed in the hangar because we didn't have enough pilots to fly them. And he wouldn't yield to me, and I wanted to say, well, I have to say to my friend, yes, I understand these airplanes were in the hangars, but it wasn't because we had too few pilots. It was because we had too many airplanes. And nobody can show me where there was a need to bomb somebody that we weren't able to bomb. That was during the time when we had total air superiority in Yugoslavia. The other argument, it's the terrorists. Yes, the communists are gone, we have the terrorists. Terrorists, vicious, evil people. I am in favor of the drones. I would like to see them killed. Osama bin Laden, not only did he kill thousands of Americans, but because he's mad at America, with an anger at Israel on the side, he slaughters hundreds of innocent Africans in Kenya and Tanzania by blowing up our embassy. This man was a mad dog. Of course he had to be dealt with. But the terrorists are greatly flattered to compare them in destructive capacity to either Hitler or the Soviet Union. They don't have nuclear weapons. They don't have delivery systems. They don't have tanks. They don't have planes. Yes, we need to fight them. Fighting the terrorists is a lot less expensive. It's harder in some ways. I wish you could defeat terrorism with nuclear submarines. Because we have them. They don't. Be over. Troops in Germany do nothing to fight terrorism. Thermonuclear weapons to destroy the Soviet Union do nothing to fight terrorism. So let me get back to one last argument, which is the most astounding at all. Defense has contributed more than half of the deficit reduction measures taken to date. Yes, from the part of the budget where defense is more than half the budget. Some, quote, want to use the military to pay for the rest, to protect the sacred cow that is entitlement spending. That's the position. And then Robert Samuelson, a former Crimson editor, has an article in the Washington Post supporting the military budget and objecting to quotes, and the headline is, Pentagon versus the welfare state. We need to reduce the deficit. Not in the near term. We should be spending some more. And every month in the last 15, private sector jobs have gone up and public sector jobs have gone down. So we've had a net increase, much smaller than we wanted. There are nearly 1 million fewer state and local employees today than there were when President Obama took office over our objections. The unemployment rate would be a couple of tenths of % lower, and these people would be out there working. So we should not be doing that in the near term. But yes, we need a long-term deficit reduction. If you exempt the military from deficit reduction, it is impossible to reduce the deficit and still have any serious effort to maintain the quality of life in America. The numbers just don't work. Think of anything we now do, environmental protection, rail transit, health care for the very poor, etc. All of those we would have to do less of, not more of. Education, community colleges, student assistance. They all go down because the military budget is so huge. It is larger than Medicare. It is one place where we can make substantial cuts and have no loss. But here's the final argument. It is equivalent, I think, inconsistency to Panetta now confessing that he hollowed out the military when he wasn't looking. It is that we cannot afford to cut the military because it will have a negative effect on jobs. The military, they say, creates jobs. Now, understand that this argument comes on the whole from people who say government spending can't create jobs, that the stimulus didn't create jobs, that government highway spending doesn't create jobs, that hiring teachers and cops doesn't create jobs. I call it weaponized Keynesianism. The argument is that no government spending creates jobs unless it's for the military. If you're spending versus not spending, yes. If the question is, do you cut the military or not, that would have some near-term job reduction. But the issue is now, it's not whether you cut the military or not. Do you cut the military or do you cut something else? There have been articles in the Boston Globe about how bad this would be for Massachusetts. But if you don't cut the military and you cut medical care in Massachusetts, it will be much worse. We make a lot of money off medical care. We make medical instruments, we have research, we have biotech. Even if you look at the job thing, we get hurt worse. Military spending is one of the least efficient ways to do jobs. That's not a reason not to do it. You do military spending not as a big public works project, but to defend yourself. And we have allies that need help. South Korea, Taiwan, Israel. Not every target everywhere all over the globe. And again, the purpose is to protect them against bad things, not to go into chaos and be alchemists and turn it into gold. There are two reasons why military spending is not so good for jobs compared to other things. Come more and more to rely on in my public sector work is a piece of wisdom imparted in a kind of allegorical way by one of the great philosophers of the 20th century. His name was Henny Youngman. But he had one that was a kind of a wife joke, but it was really very funny. How's your wife compared to what? Really quite intelligent. His answer, how's your wife, is compared to what? Every question I'm asked, I got to say, compared to what? So cutting military spending compared to cutting any other kind of spending will give you less jobs. First of all, except for the foreign aid budget, which is 4% of the military budget, more of the military budget is spent, obviously, overseas than anywhere else. Secondly, it tends to be very capital intensive. Oh, and there's a third point. When we build a bridge or do health research or do a lot of these other things, we are doing things that enhance the productive stream. When we build a nuclear weapon, we build it and hope to hell it's never used. It's not the military's fault. Much of what we do with the military, we build never to use it. So it does not have the kind of positive effects. So it comes down to two arguments why we're doing this. One, because we're getting unduly frightened by terrorism. Not that they're not vicious people. They're not the threat to us, and you fight them in different ways. By the way, much of the anti-terrorism stuff isn't even in the military budget. It's in the Homeland Security budget. So I'm talking about cutting the military budget. It got nothing to do with what we do at home. How can you be a great nation if all you do is worry about how well you live and how good your kids feel and education? I mean, it's an assertion that worrying about the quality of your lives is unworthy of a great nation. There was a debate in the 19th century about that with the role of Great Britain, with people who were the anti-imperialists. Great Britain versus Little England. Little England was a derogatory term for people who just wanted to live good lives. Well, I'm in the Little England, Little America thing. I don't think the 12-member committee is going to be able to come to an agreement. Some Democrats thought, oh, well, they'll be so afraid of what the sequester will do to military spending that they'll maybe go for raising taxes. It's not that they don't want the committee to come up with something. If the committee would have cut Medicare, Social Security, et cetera, they'd be very happy with it. But they believe that next year they can amend the sequester to exempt the military. So I think sometime next year we're going to have this fight. Because if you exempt the military from these cuts, you do it in one of two ways. Either you reduce the amount of deficit reduction that you get, or you really cut Medicare. Of course, they would like to abolish Medicare, although I apologize to Congressman Ryan, my colleague, for saying that he had a plan to abolish Medicare. That's the one that says if you're under 55, you will not get Medicare when you hit the age of Medicare at 65. If you're now under 55, when you reach 65, you won't get Medicare. You will get a voucher from the government, which you can use to pay for private insurance, which will almost certainly be much more than that. But it's unfair to say that they're abolishing Medicare, because if you were now 40 years old, when you become 65, you will not get Medicare, but you will until then pay the Medicare tax. It's really quite interesting. They leave in place the Medicare tax. So if you're under 55, they continue to tax you. By the way, if they didn't do that, they wouldn't save any money. If you remitted the tax and the program, there'd be no savings. So they charge you the full tax and don't give you the benefit. I would rather cut the military. I give Bill Clinton credit because he resisted this notion to spend more and more on the military. By the way, so did Bush Sr. As to the criticism for pulling out of Iraq, I think it helps refute the argument for more military spending. First of all, understand this is George Bush's timetable. And the Obama administration, I believe, Panetta was trying to stay in. From the conversations I had, I give Vice President Biden the credit. He was the one who most insisted, and we had this semi-public debate in the Democratic caucus. No one is arguing that after we pull out of Iraq, it will be in any way a threat to America. Even Dick Cheney has given up on weapons of mass destruction. What they say is we must protect the gains that we have made in bringing stability to Iraq. By the way, this is some stability over there. The argument is that American troops are necessary to preserve the social peace. That doesn't work. You can stop people from shooting each other. You can't make them love each other by American troops. But the justification for us staying in Iraq has nothing to do with American security. It is all about our civilizing mission to the Iraqis. Now, I think the president's right about this, but I have a new hero, a man named Peter Fuller. He's a general, and he just blew the whistle on the Afghans. He just got fired. He was the lieutenant general in charge of American training of Afghans, and he said, this is a disgrace, this is a disaster, they don't want to do anything, they don't like us, we're wasting our money here. So they fired him. Instead of saying, yeah, you're right, let's go home. I hope that the Iraq thing is the beginning. For much of our history, serving in the federal government has been a very good way to do good things. But elections have consequences. The American people gave majorities, those who voted, in 2010 to people who do not believe that there is a constructive role for government. When the government is controlled by people who do not think it has a constructive role, there's not a lot you can do that would be constructive. No, then the federal government would not be a great place to do a lot of useful things. And there are people in the federal government doing excellent work and very satisfying work. They have a very different conception. They do not see a positive role for the federal government. They underplay the role of what we can do domestically. Many of them will overdo it internationally. They have a very activist role about what you can do to fix a society overseas.
I was wondering about a statement you made about reducing military spending by $200 billion. You said $100 million of it would come from drawdown in Iraq. You said you also wanted to see $100 million more.
Right.
I'm wondering how long you think it would take to start saving the $120 million in Iraq and Afghanistan.
If you started now, you could be out of Afghanistan by the end of next year. The plan now is to save for 2014, so that would save a total of about $240. You can't just pull out. You have to phase it down, so you begin to get those savings. First of all, I would withdraw American ground troops from Western Europe. It's not just withdrawing the troops, so it's somewhat cheaper to bring them home. We do not need as many members of the military as we now have. It's not a one-for-one reduction. The military refers to it as end strength. You could substantially reduce the end strength of the military. I would reduce the stockpile of nuclear weapons. The New York Times had a very good list of ways to save on October 30th. I would recommend it on how you could reduce the stockpile of nuclear weapons. You don't need to guard them, but you also don't need to produce more. I would pull the troops out of Okinawa. I would actually reduce one of the three legs of the triad, and I would cut back on the acquisition of strategic weapons. The other thing is I would have the Pentagon be more efficient. And there is an acknowledged inefficiency. But here's the problem. You cannot simply make people from the outside be more efficient. You cannot micromanage a complex organization. The only way to increase efficiency with any organization of that complexity, in my judgment, is to put some limit on what they spend. I guarantee you, if they knew that the money was tighter, they could be much tougher on the contractors. So it would be a reduction in end strength, pulling back from much of the world. I think Libya was a good example of how we could get our NATO allies to do more. I don't think we need as many nuclear submarines or as many aircraft carriers. Again, if you look at the dominance we have over the rest of the world and reducing the end strength. I would not cut compensation to the military. Now, as to reducing the end strength, by the way, you're not firing anybody in the military. That would be outrageous after these people volunteered. But the average enlistment, I'm told, is about 6 years. So you can attrit down in the military very quickly. In 2 years, 1/3 are up, and you don't have to replace them all. I was told by a high-ranking Obama official when I said we should pull out of Iraq, no, the Iraqis want us to stay. Well, who the hell wouldn't want Americans to stay for nothing? Some cop offered to sit in your backyard all night, well, for nothing, you'd say, hey, I'd love to have you, pal. Then this historic tradition of Democratic presidents being afraid that they'll appear soft on national security. That's why our extremely able former governor wound up in a tank. Michael Dukakis is a first-rate guy, and he shouldn't have been in the tank. But I understand. They said, oh, you're a liberal. You got to show you're ready to shoot people. He, who had been in the military and had a better military service, he was in the tank and he lost. That contributed to his defeat, sadly, and it was a great loss for the country. Under Obama's leadership, Gaddafi, bin Laden, and al-Awlaki were all killed by Americans. I would hope he would feel insulated from the charge that he's too soft to be able to do that. I think the reason for the high level of spending is less the military-industrial complex, meaning the people who make money by selling weapons. But it's more the greatness of purpose and even more, oh my God, America's threatened. It is this perception that there are crocodiles out there. There be dragons. Ironically, one of the issues that John Kennedy used against Richard Nixon was that the Eisenhower administration was soft on defense. It was the missile gap. John Kennedy accused the Eisenhower administration of allowing a missile gap to appear between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, in which we were on the short end. Now, that got some currency because the Soviets were the first into space. The Soviets got into space in 1958 before we did, so it was plausible. It is true that the two largest recipients of American foreign aid are both Israel and Egypt. That was a promise America made over at Camp David. President Carter said at the time, if you guys make peace, I'll pay you forever. And I think with all of the ups and downs, that Israeli-Egyptian peace is one of the few bright things we've seen. I notice that it does appear to be surviving the Egyptian overthrow of Mubarak. There was a fear that it wouldn't. As to the settlements, yes, I think we should make clear our opposition to the settlements. I oppose the policies of a lot of countries. I think India is continuing to violate the UN mandate in Kashmir. I think India treats the Kashmiris who don't want to be part of India badly, and we should put pressure on them. But I don't want to cut off relations with India. I noticed that President Abbas just said that he acknowledges that the Arabs made a mistake when they opposed partition in 1948 and tried instead to wipe out Israel. A lot of this happened since then. But if I was an Israeli, I'd be even more strongly opposed to those settlements, particularly out there in the West Bank, where there were military drain on Israel and a financial drain. Both under Ehud Barak and under Ehud Olmert, I believe Israel offered, with American support, deals to the Palestinians that were very good deals that would have ended the settlements and, in fact, led to the expulsion of some of the settlers, and they rejected them. And I think, yes, there were problems with Israel and the settlers, in part because of Israel's political situation, but there is still, given the role of Hamas and in Gaza, a real problem with there not yet being a willingness to accept Israel's existence. And I include with that even Fatah, because they have said, well, they will not accept Israel as a Jewish democratic state, apparently because there is, on the part of some of the Arabs, an objection to there being a theocratic state that does not extend to Saudi Arabia. The frustration here is, and it really goes to the irresponsibility, both with Iran and North Korea, of China and Russia. Part of the reason we have not been more effective in trying to restrain the nuclearization in both countries, which are both trying to get nuclear weapons, is that neither China nor Russia will fully support that. I do not understand that. If I were Russia, I would be more worried about the Iranians having nuclear weapons than I am. They can wind up with the Chechen irredentist or others. And similarly, if I was China, I would worry about that nutcase in North Korea having a water gun, much less a nuclear weapon, right on my own border. We should continue to do what we can with sanctions. My understanding is if nuclear weapons go off, you can probably identify where they came from. I think both the North Koreans and the Iranians are being told, God help you if one of your nuclear weapons goes off somewhere. Particularly in the case of Iran, trying to take out the nuclear weapons. At this point, they're dispersed, they're hidden. That's what I would do, is to try and do as much as we can economically. You have to tell both North Korea and Iran that if they abandon nuclear weapons, there's some benefits. It cannot be all threats. There have to be credible promises, because that would be a real benefit to us. But the ultimate lever there, I think, is the threat of very serious destruction if they do this, which would be something I would hate to do, but I think you have to make that threat. Although we have killed some, the MX missile. We did manage to get a majority to kill the second engine for the F-35. But the only way it can be done is compared to what? There is very little chance of defeating a weapons system in general. But we will not be voting on whether or not to kill a weapons system. We will be voting on whether or not to kill a weapons system or make you wait 2 more years to get on Medicare or cut Medicaid. That is, it's the zero-sum game. And I believe if Congress has to vote next year on amending the sequester and exempting the military so that a greater burden falls on Medicare. Yeah, no, do I think that Russia and China would like to do everything? Sure. But that doesn't mean you need a thermonuclear arsenal. I didn't say they weren't a threat. I do not think either one of them is a threat of the magnitude of what the Soviet Union was. And I want to maintain a superiority over them. As to espionage, that they're spying on us, guess who spies on them? Countries spy on each other. What do you think the CIA is, a tourism bureau? I do not have a high regard for either the Soviet Union, for Russia or China, and we need to be on guard. The point is that $450 billion a year, our military would not just be superior to Russia and China, but it would be increasing by more than they are increasing every year. That superiority would grow every year. So it's not a case of thinking that they don't have to worry about them. I want to leave the 7th Fleet in there, and I think Taiwan is a great democratic success. I would say no to China. If you invade Taiwan, we will be there. But there's no reason to have the Marines on Okinawa. It's one thing to say we will be there in Taiwan. So it's not a case of either or. It's a case of being sensible, and I think we could be a lot more sensible.